Molt bona tarda a tothom. En nom del CCCB us vull donar la benvinguda a aquest vespre tan especial. Avui és una nit d'aquelles tan especials al CCCB, on tenim el goig i l'honor d'acollir a John Coetzee, escriptor i Premi Nobel de Literatura del 2003, en conversa amb Valerie Miles, escriptora, editora i directora de Granta en castellà i una grandíssima connectora de mons, a qui vull agrair-li molt particularment i personalment el que hagi fet possible la presència de Coetzee a Barcelona. És un honor per nosaltres avui acollir-los. Avui tanquem un programa molt intens de 4 dies de reflexió sobre Europa en el marc de la presidència espanyola de la Unió Europea, que és qui ha fet possible aquest programa i que ha estat un dels principals programes culturals de la presidència espanyola de la Unió Europea. Quan vam començar a pensar en aquest programa vam pensar que seria interessant incorporar una veu no europea, intentar obrir aquestes fronteres d'Europa que sovint ens tanquen a nosaltres mateixos, i qui millor que una figura com John Coetzee per parlar-nos d'Europa. Avui parlaran d'Europa i de les visions que hi ha d'Europa a la literatura extraeuropea, del paper de Rússia a dins i fora d'Europa i també d'altres temes com les implicacions de l'expansió mundial de la llengua anglesa. Moltíssimes gràcies per acompanyar-nos en aquest vespre tan especial. Moltíssimas gracias, John Coetzee, por aceptar la nuestra invitación y muchísimas gracias, Valerie, por haberlo hecho posible. Gracias.
Moltes gràcies al CCCB, a Judit Carrera i al seu equip per l'amable invitació a estendre el diàleg que el John i jo hem anat mantenint al llarg d'aquests anys i que va tenir un moment significatiu fa poc temps al Museu del Prado, quan John va acceptar inaugurar la seva nova residència Escribir el Prado, patrocinat per la Fundació Loewe. I gràcies també a John per el gran privilegi d'estar aquí aquesta nit amb tu.
Gracias, Valerie. Gracias también a Judith Carrera por la invitación a Barcelona y al CCCB. Nuestra conversación esta tarde tendrá lugar en inglés. Valerie es, por supuesto, perfectamente bilingüe, pero para nuestra tarea aquí hoy, mi español es demasiado limitado. So this evening, the two of us, Valerie and I, neither of us a European, are going to have a wide-ranging conversation which will include some thoughts on Europe. I must, at this point, be careful how I tread. Some years ago, I published a work of fiction called Diary of a Bad Year, in which the diarist, a writer much like myself, has caustic things to say about writers who set themselves up as wide-ranging commentators, as well as about the journalists and interviewers and editors who indulge writers by creating channels for them to broadcast their opinions. To a certain extent, Diary of a Bad Year has been overtaken by history. Not only writers, but entire populations now have channels to broadcast their opinions. Of course, I refer to social media. The key word here is opinion. As the word is used nowadays, an opinion is an assertion whose force or validity depend not so much on its truth as on who stands behind it, who backs it. Asserting our opinions becomes a way in which we claim a place in the world. As free persons, we have a right to have opinions and to assert them in the public space. Taken to an extreme, we thus arrive at a model of a social world in which each actor, each of us, has his or her opinions and asserts these opinions, and one's right to have and express opinions is fundamental, cannot be contested. In this social world, there are no right opinions and wrong opinions, no good opinions and bad opinions, since to call someone else's opinions wrong or bad is just an opinion in itself. There is simply a Darwinian marketplace of opinions in which some opinions survive and flourish and others do not. Now, we all recognize the world I've been describing. It is the world of the West, the world we inhabit. How we got here is an interesting question, but it is not my job tonight to pursue the question. All I will say is that, in my opinion, it is a profoundly disturbing historical development from which I hope we will emerge sooner rather than later. I raise the subject of opinions for a reason, to indicate that I am deeply aware of my own limitations as a commentator on European affairs. I will try to avoid expressing opinions that I cannot back up with reasoned argument. And when I express feelings, I will make it clear that they are no more than feelings, which, being feelings, are changeable and evanescent. To anyone who knows my work, it will be clear that although I was born in Africa and spent many years in the United States, and have for 2 decades resided in Australia, my intellectual and literary heritage is not African or American or Australian, but European. Whether as the descendant of colonists whom Europe flung out into the world during the great epoch of colonialism that commenced in the late 15th century, whether persons like myself remain part of Europe's intellectual and literary history, whether whatever contribution persons like myself make to history is made to a European branch of history, is an interesting question, but not for me to debate. The fact is, I am an outsider to Europe, and, speaking in a genealogical sense, have been an outsider for many generations. At the same time, I am intimate with Europe in the sense that I have been in conversation with some of Europe's finest representatives for most of my life. So that is how I present myself to you tonight, as that kind of outsider. Also, I should mention, I present myself as the author of a work of fiction set in the city of Barcelona, a city which, as it happens, I hardly know at first hand.
Well, I agree, John, that writers ought not act as opinion-making machines, but words are events. They can change things. They can do things. Susan Sontag writes in her essay, The Conscience of Words, that as members of the literary community, writers become emblems of the persistence and the necessity of individual vision. So it becomes the writer's job to pursue complexity and to speak truth to power. But of course, that places us in the conundrum for what is truth. How to live with wisdom in an age of information overload when the wisdom of literature is antithetical to having opinions, even apparently correct ones. We share the condition of outsiders. I occupy a space that is entirely in between languages, continents, always both here and there, always neither here nor there. I'm a descendant also of settlers who left Europe in the 19th century looking for opportunity in the New World, specifically New York and Pennsylvania, two states that were originally British colonies. My family comes from Eastern and Central Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Russia, the Ukraine. And my last name, in fact, is not Miles, but Chmielowska, and from Southern Europe and the Levant. And in fact, my great-grandmother's last name is none other than Barcelona, Rosa Barcelona. So when I feel pressure from my family to return home, I always remind them that they're the ones that are still wandering. I'm the one who found her way home. My sentimental and intellectual education are also European, but are not limited to it. The United States is a colonial extension of Europe and inextricable from that tradition. But there was one original thinker, a visionary and a poet, who gave us a new one, or at least an outcropping of tradition, and that is Ralph Waldo Emerson. It was Emerson who said, by the way, "Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradict everything you said the day before." So if the conversation allows, perhaps I can talk about him further along. But first, I think we'd all very much like to hear a little bit about take up your comment about your nouvelle, El Polaco, which is partly set in Barcelona. Why here, if it's not a city you are that familiar with yet?
Yes. Valerie, in my eyes, composing a work of fiction, creating any work of art, is a practical process, more like cooking than like philosophizing. What is important to a writer is above all what works. So, shall I set the story in Barcelona? Let me try it out. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't, if I, so to speak, bring it to my lips and it doesn't taste right, let me try something else. Let me try setting the story in St. Petersburg, for example. If it doesn't again work, perhaps there's something wrong about beginning the fiction by setting it in a specific locale. So let's abandon that recipe and try out another one. What works is, to me, a matter of intuition, of judgment, of experience. Why this particular story, the story called El Polaco, should work in Barcelona, but not in St. Petersburg, as opposed to whether it works in Barcelona, is no doubt an interesting question, but it's not of practical importance to me as a writer. The same comment holds for other aspects of the book besides the locale. The reader of the book pauses, for example, on some other detail in the fiction. Federico Montpou, for example, or almond groves in Mallorca, and wonders, why is this detail there? But to me as a writer, why is it there is not the relevant question. The relevant question is, does it contribute to the success of the book as a whole? Try leaving it out. Does the concoction still taste the same? If yes, omit it. If not, its absence makes a difference, therefore leave it in.
Well, in an interview, in Doubling the Point, your book of essays and interviews collection, you say that in each of the 4 novels after Dusklands, there seems to be one feature or technique on which there is a heavy concentration. In The Heart of the Country, it was cutting and montage. In Waiting for the Barbarians, it was milieu. In Life and Times of Michael Kay, it was the pace of narration. And in Foe, it was voice. So I wonder, what is the feature or technique in El Polaco?
In El Polaco, I went back to numbered blocks of prose, a practice that worked well for me in the novel In the Heart of the Country. The practice enables me to be brief, to offer the story in ordered fragments with a minimum of connective tissue. Life goes on, of course, between the gaps, but that life is not part of the structure of the book.
Well, Witold, who is the Pole in El Polaco, quotes Octavio Paz from La Llama Doble. He says, para el amante, el cuerpo deseado es alma. In what ways did Paz's writing influence El Polaco?
Yeah. Octavio Paz is undoubtedly present in the novel. He's quoted, or at least paraphrased in the text, specifically his reflections on the nature of love, on what he calls the double flame of the sexual and the spiritual, the two flames burning together. I'm not sure that Paz influenced the book itself, but his thoughts on erotic life are certainly thoughts that made a mark on Witold, on the Pole. Yeah.
And the novel recreates the feelings of estrangement and existential crisis that language can provoke, often when it short circuits, when you get caught in between languages in that inchoate space. And it takes up the impossibility of carrying across from one language to another, not so much words as the systems of assumptions lying behind those words, as you write in your essay, Isaac Newton and the Ideal of a Transparent Language. How is being so involved in translation now influencing the way you write? You once said that, no siento el inglés como mi idioma, es un idioma extranjero en el cual escribo.
Yeah, what I said many years ago, back in 1987, in the essay on Newton from which you quote, is actually somewhat of an oversimplification, but basically I still stand by it. There are in each language words that carry a heavy philosophical or religious or historical weight. Think of a word like Greek agape. And to translate such words adequately, you have somehow to carry over the complex of meaning behind it too. Now, you ask whether my involvement not only in abstract questions of translation, but also in the practicalities of translating my own work and the work of others has had an effect on my writing. And I suspect the answer is yes. At the moment, when I put the words down on the page, which are usually English words, I'm certainly conscious of the problems that my words may set for my translator, and of what solutions to those problems my translator may have to search for. For that reason, I tend deliberately to avoid idioms or turns of phrase that will cause problems, because they're so idiosyncratically English. And one consequence is that my English, my particular idioma, lacks the earthiness, the rootedness, the solidity of the English of less self-conscious native speakers.
Well, let's talk about music. The reader can feel Witold by listening to Chopin.
We should perhaps mention that Witold is a pianist.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Witold is a pianist who plays Chopin.
Chopin, yes.
So by listening, the reader can feel him. No? The novel expands into another dimension, really. It intensifies our experience of Witold. It comes alive. Perhaps you could comment on the element of music in the story. Do you want readers, would you like readers to listen to the music he is playing while they're reading? For example, the romantic melancholy, the longing, the love as will and idea.
Yeah. Do I hope that readers of El Polaco will know the music of Chopin, know it intimately? Yes and no. There's no such thing as direct knowledge of music. What we know through our sense of hearing is always already an interpretation, colored by the art and the personality of the interpreter. So, interpreter in this case is Witold, whom you refer to. Part of El Polaco, a minor part, concerns traditions of interpretation of Chopin. In one of these traditions, Chopin is regarded as a feminine musician. In reaction, another tradition tries to masculinize his music. And the development of the pianoforte from the so-called feminine Pleyel instrument, which Chopin preferred, to the more masculine Steinway instrument, contributes to this contrastive approach. At the moments in El Polaco when specific pieces of music by Chopin are mentioned, it would, in my opinion, be excessive to expect readers to recall from their memory not only the memory of the piece in one interpretation, but the piece in two contrasted interpretations.
Well, I wonder, the novel is set around love. I wonder if it could be in a way a love song to modern love, or simply a way forward for Beatriz to gain agency through the letters that she writes to Witold.
Beatriz being the woman that Witold falls in love with, yes. Is the story a love song to modern love? I don't know. I'm reluctant to set myself up as an interpreter of my own books. And added to that, I am very far from being an expert on forms of love, ancient or modern. But from the outside, the Pole's love for Beatrice strikes me as anything but modern. It may even be old-fashioned and out of date. Beatrice herself is a more up-to-date figure than Witold. But in her attitude towards sex and love, I suspect she will strike younger readers as representative of their parents' generation more than their own.
Well, I wonder, and we will be moving into talking about the South, but perhaps could you be setting the novel in Spain as a little bit the European South, to explore a country that's still an outsider sometimes in Europe, or on its western fringes, and considered sometimes as extravagant, no? Thinking of your deep admiration for Don Quixote, I wonder if by extension how Cervantes would have written the novel from Dulcinea's perspective, or from another character's perspective.
Yeah, well, the South is a recurring topos in European poetry, in European music, European art, particularly in the 19th century. The South is this longed-for land of light, warmth, and gaiety, where the cold northerner can shed his inhibitions and plunge into the life of the senses. Think of Gauguin and the South Seas, for example. And you're right, for a long time, the Spain of gypsy girls dancing the flamenco functioned as the South, or as one of the Souths for Northern Europe. As for Cervantes, he offers us, it seems to me, in the second book of the Quixote, exactly the change of perspective that you imagine, change of perspective of narration. Except, of course, as being a great magician of fiction, he adds a dizzying second layer of complexity to it, and I won't go into it, but I refer you to Book 2, Chapter 2 of the Quixote.
Well, you were in Madrid for several weeks recently as the inaugural fellow of Writing the Prado residency. And during that time, you wrote your own short speech in Spanish and deposited manuscripts in the Vault of Letters in the Instituto Cervantes. And what you said was, acepté la invitación, pues de manera más indirecta me permite asociar mi nombre con el de Miguel de Cervantes, padre y madre de todos los novelistas y el escritor que más venero. Perhaps one of Europe's greatest claims is its rich linguistic fabric. You speak several languages, along with Afrikaans, your mother tongue, and yet you write in English. Why?
Yeah, why do I write in English? Let me begin by saying something about my personal linguistic history. It's a somewhat complicated history, but I would argue it's more representative of the world of the 21st century than might at first seem. So, on my mother's side, I'm descended from a Pole born in Prussian-ruled Silesia, who decided early in life that the future was German, not Polish. Accordingly, he Germanized himself by changing his name, by attending a German school, and marrying a German girl. Their children, born in the United States, spoke German at home and English in public. From the United States, they moved to Africa, where they continued their German-English bilingual practices. So what I'm telling you is this a story of how, for the sake of social advancement, a mother tongue, first Polish, then German, was abandoned in favor of a father language, first German, then English. That's my mother's side. On my father's side, I'm descended from people who migrated from the Netherlands to Africa in the 17th century. During the Napoleonic Wars, their little Dutch colony was taken over by the British, and its inhabitants became subjects of the British Crown. My ancestors accommodated themselves to their new masters, conducting their public life in English while continuing to speak Dutch at home. Again, we have a story of a mother tongue, Dutch, being abandoned in favor of a more powerful father tongue, English.
Well, the British also took over the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam and renamed it New York in the 17th century. Melville was descended from those original Dutch settlers. And as I mentioned, my forebears anglified our surname to fit in better. My great-grandfather, a Pole, who arrived in the US in the 1880s, spoke some other language. He didn't speak Polish or Lithuanian like the rest did. None of my elders can tell me which language it was. Yiddish, German, Russian, Ukrainian. I don't know, but the following generation was already raised in English and didn't really care. So there's a mystery language in my linguistic heritage that I experience as a painful event. It's a loss to time, to prejudice, to the world wars, to the Cold War, not to anything good in any case.
Yeah, in my case, both the maternal and paternal sides of my family To both of them, English, the master tongue, seemed to be the way of the future, and an English language education seemed the best way of ensuring that a child would prosper. So the phenomenon of which I am an instance, or I was an instance, the child who masters English but is not a member of the Anglo culture, this phenomenon has not been uncommon across British colonies in Africa and Asia. As British control withdrew after 1945, significant minorities were left behind. Middle-class natives, so to speak, who under the British had done their best to anglicize themselves, and after 1945 continued to feel that they were part of a worldwide Anglo culture whose center was now perhaps the United States rather than Britain.
Yes. Well, and how did this complex linguistic background influence you as a writer?
Yeah. Well, as a child, I turned out to be good at English. In class, I was always top of the class. At school, I was always top of the class in English. And when I was 17, I enrolled at the University of Cape Town to study a subject called English, Language and Literature. And after graduating, I went to London, which was the heart of the old British Empire, to live and work there. I adapted my colonial way of speaking, my colonial manners. With my white skin, I could soon pass undetected in an English crowd. After England, I moved to the United States to continue my education. And I graduated with a doctorate in English studies. Returned to South Africa, where I was hired to teach English language and literature to the sons and daughters of Anglo-South Africans. Now, was there any higher pinnacle to conquer for a young man with not a drop of English blood in his veins?
Difficult.
I became a writer too, an English writer in the sense that I wrote in the English language, though I tended to treat the language with suspicion rather than affection, reflecting a feeling that it did not really belong to me. I wrote novels, which were published in New York and London, but since I was neither American nor British, my books were listed in my publishers' catalogues under the catch-all title, World Literature. Do you want me to continue with my story, my adventures with the English language?
Please do. Please do.
My books were also widely translated at a time in history when many more books were translated out of English than into English. Why was this so? The answer I received from the publishing industry, that English speakers did not read foreign books because they were on the whole not curious about the foreign outside world, was true but only partly true. A fuller answer would have been that English speakers could afford to be indifferent to the outside world, whereas the outside world could not afford to be indifferent to the Anglo world, and in particular to the United States. As the United States had become master of the world, so the language of the United States had become the language of the world. Foreigners needed to learn English. That was the rule. It was not necessary for Anglos to learn foreign languages. I visited Iceland, and in Reykjavik, I met two adolescent boys, sons of my Icelandic host. These boys told me in excellent English how much they disliked their native Icelandic language. It was too difficult, they said, and anyhow, it had no future. The future belonged to English. At more or less that moment, I began to question my position in the system. As an assimilated foreigner whose very mastery of the master language seemed to confirm that it was only natural that English should rule the world. I'd always felt foreign in Anglo culture, felt like an imposter. Now, the language I spoke and wrote so well that it could have been mistaken for my mother tongue, began to feel foreign too. The language of my books began to assume a more abstract quality. I had lost interest in trying to sound like a native, that is, a native English speaker. What was going on? I told myself I was feeling my way toward a rootless language, a language divorced from any sociocultural home. I always checked translations of my books when they were translated into languages that I had some knowledge of. Now I began to work more closely with my translators, with a new interest in hearing how I sounded outside English. I also began to ask myself why the versions that my translators produced had to faithfully follow the English text, why they had to carry a label saying that they were not the original story, but a translation of it. Did a translation necessarily have to have a secondary status, the status of an imitation, an imperfect imitation of a unique original? Excuse the long answer to a very simple question.
Well, Garcia Marquez glowingly spoke of his translator, Gregory Rabassa, in a Paris Review interview, saying that a good translation is always a recreation in another language. And he said that, I think my work has been completely recreated in English. The impression one gets is that the translator read the book and then rewrote it from his recollections. That's why I have such admiration for translators. They are intuitive rather than intellectual. And Rabassa, in turn, talks about living in that space between languages, both as a reader and a writer, moving back and forth, being one and the other as a translator.
Yeah. You quote Garcia Marquez as talking about recreation. I think recreation is a good word. Over the years, my German translator, whose name is Reinhild Böhnke, has produced text after text in German that, to my eyes, are in no respect inferior to the English original. If she and I were to switch roles, if her text were to appear in German under her authorial name, and then later my text were to appear in English as a translation out of the German, would our ruse be detected? I doubt it. As her translator, I would be praised for the accomplishments that translators are usually praised for: fidelity to the original, mastery of idiom, etc., etc. I mentioned the adventure I had in Iceland, and more or less at the same time, with the backing of a sympathetic publisher in Argentina, Maria Soledad Cosatini, I embarked on a series of collaborations, turning English texts that I had written into Spanish texts that were intended to carry no marks of secondary status. Where my English proved recalcitrant to Spanish reformulation, it was the English that had to be erased and rewritten. It was no accident that these collaborative books were published first in Argentina, then later in Australia, 2 countries of the Southern Hemisphere. They appeared first in Spanish, just as the afterworld in which my 3 Jesus novels are situated is a Spanish-speaking world. Spanish speaking, not because I think Spanish is in some sense better than English, but simply because in the world we live in, Spanish is viable as an alternative to English. And also because I thought it would give a jolt to Anglo readers to find that the language of the afterlife would not be English. These collaborative texts appeared first in Spanish, and they appeared first in the Southern Hemisphere. Thus, they did not have to pass the scrutiny of the gatekeepers of the North, the editors, reviewers, etc., before they could be read in the South. It's important.
Very.
So in this way, we arrive at El Polaco, which first saw the light of day in Buenos Aires in 2022, then in Australia some months ago, then a few days ago in the North.
And I've spoken to the translator of El Polaco, Mariana Dimopoulos, and she told me that she was intrigued by the idea of making a new original. She said she tried to create a text in Spanish with English remnants, so to speak. A Spanish that would sound slightly like English, that readers would recognize as foreign, but still acceptable and even graceful.
Yeah. Yes, the language in which El Polaco is composed is unusually bodiless and unlocated. It's not at all obvious where in the world it comes from, given that English is used as a medium for writing over so much of the world today. It also lacks the solidity, the semantic solidity, but also the sonic solidity that characterizes most high-quality literary English. Now, there are two reasons why the book inhabits this null linguistic state. The first is that I deliberately starved it of what I think of as native nutriments while I was composing it. The second is that by the time I began to compose it, I reached a point in my life where I was seriously concerned about the English language as a global political force and wished to emphasize my personal rupture with it. To be brief, let me simply say that I intended that no translation of this particular book should be inferior to the English language version, and thus that the notion of the original version of the Pole or El Polaco could be brought into question. I intended the English text, once it had metamorphosed into the Spanish text, would retire, withdraw into the shadows, while the Spanish text would give birth to a multiplicity of translations. This plan of mine was defeated. It was defeated by a superior force that operates in the world publishing industry. Publishers in Poland, in France, in Japan, and other countries simply declined to translate from the Spanish text. The Spanish text, they said, did not constitute the original, and they preferred to translate from the original. It was an article of faith with them that one should translate only from the original. Thus, I reached an impasse. For a lengthy period, the only version of the book that existed in public was the Spanish one, which was treated like any other Spanish book, in the sense that it was reviewed in Spanish language periodicals and bought by Spanish-speaking readers.
Well, perhaps this is a good point where we could move into talking about the South and what the South means to you. In the past few years, you've visited and given lectures in a number of Latin American countries, notably Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Chile, and Argentina, of course. In Chile, there's a prize that carries your name. In Colombia, there is a center of study that is devoted to your work. And in Argentina, you held a professorship in literatures of the South. Perhaps you could tell us what is meant by literatures of the South.
Yes, between 2015 and 2019, I occupied a personal cátedra at the Universidad San Martín in Buenos Aires, where I dedicated my energies to bringing together writers from 3 continents that are far apart in geography and language, but so it seems to me have an affiliation in their history and in their relation to the land. On the one hand, I refer to the vast literature of Latin America, especially to the literature of Argentina. On the other, to the less vast, but still considerable literatures of South Africa and Australia. Now, some of the fruits of the cátedra have been intangible, some more tangible. Among the more tangible results, scores of students attended courses in Southern literatures taught by writers from Southern Africa and Australia. A number of books by Australian, South African, and Mozambican writers have been issued in Argentina, and in the reverse direction, an Australian publishing house has initiated a series of translations of Argentine writers. In addition, we've been able to bring several Argentine writers to Australia on extended residencies. My overriding concern as a teacher was that students should get to meet and interact with writers from the South without northern mediation. That is, without having to pass the cultural gatekeepers of the North, of the metropolis, people who, from a northern perspective, decide which books from Latin America will get translated into English and which books will not, who decide which figures from the South will be promoted worldwide and which will not, and most importantly, who decide which stories by the South about itself will be accepted into the repertoire of world literature and which will not.
Now, I notice that you talk about the South, not the global South. Why is that?
Yeah, because to my way of thinking, the South is a real part of the real world, with a climate and flora and fauna of its own, and indeed with more than just natural features in common, with strong commonalities of history and culture. The commonalities of history include long and complex histories of colonization. That is the South. The so-called global South, on the other hand, is merely a concept. It's an abstraction invented by social scientists. It is the negative other, so to speak, of the North. It's a site of absences, absence of wealth, absence of infrastructure, absence of communications. And that's the global South.
Now, another of your activities in Latin America was to publish in Buenos Aires a 12-volume Biblioteca Personal. You then gathered the essays that you wrote as the introductions to the books that you chose into an excellent book of essays titled Late Essays in English, meaning that your work in the Spanish-speaking sparks new work for your readers around the world. How did this come about?
Well, let me tell you the story. In Argentina, the phrase Biblioteca Personal carries Borgesian overtones, because during his lifetime, Jorge Luis Borges edited 2 libraries for publishers. The first under the Italian title La Biblioteca di Babele, and the second under the title Biblioteca Personal. So when I say he edited these libraries, I mean that he selected the books and provided them with prefaces. The Biblioteca di Babile, created for an Italian publisher in the 1970s, consists of 33 volumes, all in the genre of fantasy. Borges' Biblioteca Personal, created for an Argentine publisher, was intended to run to 100 volumes, but was cut short by his death in 1986. So by that time, some 70 volumes had appeared. The prefaces furnished by Borges were very brief, a page or two in length. In 2014, I was invited by an Argentine publisher, El Hilo de Ariadna, to create a Biblioteca Personal J. Coetzee, and I accepted the invitation. However, I said, I wanted my introductions to be more substantial than those provided by Borges, to be more like essays in which I would explore the specific virtues of the books in question. And since I had no intention of writing 100 such essays, and since the people at El Hilo had no intention of committing themselves to a 100-volume series, we agreed that my personal library would consist of 12 volumes. So much for the background to the Biblioteca Personal and its links to Borges, which, to my mind, don't run very deep.
Well, could you tell us a little bit more about the books that you selected?
Yes, I'm happy to do so because it will provide me with an avenue to begin to talk about Europe. Now, 11 of the 12 books that make up the library were works of fiction, the 12th an anthology of poetry from archaic times to the present.
Well, I know you read a lot of poetry, and that it has a strong influence on your work, and perhaps that's something we might explore in a little while. But for now, why don't you talk about what these 11 favored writers have to say to Europe in the third decade of the 21st century?
Yeah. Well, I can't talk about all, so let me single out two writers who are, to my mind, most interesting in this respect. The two are Robert Musil and Robert Walser. Gustave Flaubert is on the list, but he's not going to be one of the writers I talk about here. I revere Flaubert as a technician of the novel. In his day, I think Flaubert was thought of as a writer who was bringing the methods of science into novel writing, but Flaubert considered that to be nonsense. What he was doing was to bring the full intensity of his aesthetic vision and the full range of his artistic resources to bear on the case of Emma Bovary, a rather shallow young woman. And what is revolutionary about Flaubert's novel, to my mind, is that he devotes to the life of Emma Bovary artistic labors that properly belong to a figure of tragedy.
Well, as we know, once a novel is out there in the world, each reader experiences the story differently. I read my Bovary, not in the provinces of Europe, but in the woods of the New World as a very young girl, and when nobody was looking, because had they been, they probably would have taken it away from me very quickly and replaced it with a copy of Little Women. Flaubert described a society in which the only possible end for women of Emma Bovary's nature and circumstances was death. She held fire. She was passionate. She wanted to feel alive in a dull world. She read bad novels, like the Quixote did, and went mad in her search for love. She met with a Pharisaic world that wasn't able to recognize her, value her. After reading the novel, stunned, I told myself that now I understand how dangerous literature can be. I think of Bovary and Lolita as two female characters who act as mirrors. They reflect the society that's built around them by their authors, but they also reflect the society that reads them. And as society changes over time, when there are different circumstances, their reflections transform and deform.
That's very interesting, yeah. I mentioned Robert Musil and Robert Walser. Let me begin by talking about Walser, because Walser is very interesting in the context of a series of talks on the subject of Europe. Walser came from the heart of Europe, namely Switzerland, a country which in many ways tries not to be part of Europe or to be forgotten by Europe. Switzerland is a small and unimportant country, say the Swiss. If you are Swiss, say the Swiss, you are doomed to be minor. And Walser's books are essentially about being Swiss. As a young man, Walser tried to escape his Swiss fate by running away to Germany. But Swissness followed him wherever he went. In the end, he stopped running and came back home, resigning himself to being Swiss and concentrating his energies on doing the kind of writing that Swiss writers do, namely minor writing. Novels usually have a single major character called the hero or the heroine, surrounded by a cast of minor characters. In Walser's novels, however, the hero is a minor personage. He may have passions, but they are neither lofty nor strong passions. As a moral being, he is neither particularly good nor particularly bad. His actions end in neither triumph nor disaster. We may feel amused as we read about him, but he is not a comic character. We may feel sorry for him, yet he puts up quite a strong resistance against being sentimentalized. As we read Walser, all our preconceptions about Switzerland are confirmed. At the same time, at a deeper level, all these preconceptions are being subjected to the sharp light of irony.
And from Switzerland, I know you want to move to Austria. And to a philosophical novelist who wanted to publish Kafka very early on, and who was a devoted reader of Emerson's, by the way.
Yeah, you referred to Robert Musil, yeah. Musil belonged to a generation of German-speaking intellectuals who lived through the breakdown of the European order, first artistic, then political, between 1890 and 1939. And his great novel, The Man Without Qualities, set out to diagnose this breakdown, which in Musil's view derived from the failure of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment political doctrines to make space for mass civilization growing up in cities. Fascism, in Musil's analysis, was a reaction against the challenges of modern life, industrialization, urbanization in particular, for which the German people were unprepared, a reaction which then grew into a revolt against civilization itself. Musil's career as a writer was thwarted and deformed by the rise of the Nazis, who drove him into exile and banned his books. His diaries, which record his increasingly hopeless efforts to capture the currents of his times in his novel In Progress, this is The Man Without Qualities, these diaries may ultimately turn out to be as moving and enduring a monument as the never-completed novel itself.
Well, Musil's big novel project was thwarted by history, you say, by the rise of fascism and Europe's plunge into war. But at least Musil was able to see out the war from the safety of Switzerland. That wasn't true of all its contemporaries, was it?
No, it certainly wasn't. There were some who failed to see the coming storm or failed to recognize how all-encompassing it would be. And here I think particularly of Irene Nemirovsky, who had left Tsarist Russia behind her for what she thought was the safety of France. And then, when France capitulated to the Nazis, did not flee south, believing naively that her connections with the French right would save her. They didn't. She was transported to Auschwitz, where she died in 1942, leaving her magnum opus, Suite Française, unfinished.
Yes. Well, what about moving now outside of Europe? What about fellow Nobel Prize laureate and also fellow Australian, Patrick White? He won the award in 1973 for, in the words of the Swedish Academy, an epic and psychological narrative art which has introduced a new continent to literature.
Yes. Patrick White was the first Australian writer to win a Nobel Prize, but for reasons that are obscure to me, he's no longer much read in Australia. He's certainly the greatest novelist that Australia has produced. He came from an upper-class Anglo-Australian family. He received his schooling in England, studied European languages at Cambridge University, fought for the British Armed Forces in World War II. His intellectual inheritance was thoroughly European, and his great novels are set, for the most part, in Australia. Nevertheless, they reflect profoundly on the overarching imperial project of transplanting Christian European culture to Europe's colonies across the world, a project in which bearers of European culture, like himself, were intended to be leaders. What we find in the novels instead is the sterility of the great imperial gift to the world, its inability to take root, and the resistance of the Australian earth itself to this alien culture.
Well, I'd like to transport us back in time, if only for a moment, to the 19th century and the work of Ralph Waldo Emerson, an essayist, philosopher, and poet. Emerson was a stylist, and his writing on language and nature remains highly influential. He once said that Americans go to Europe to be Americanized. He was acknowledging that the old world would inevitably be reflected in any definition of the new. But Emerson became somewhat of the renegade. He left the organized church of doctrine and hierarchy and gave a new language to social reform. And then he gave Europe back to itself anew. So there are two reasons why I'm bringing Emerson up tonight. First, as a wink to my translation students on this day, that is the feast of Saint Jerome, otherwise San Jerónimo, or known as International Translation Day. So to the translators here tonight, congratulations. And I'm dedicating this to mis alumnos, amados y muy añorados, some of whom are listening to us this evening from different parts of the world. For many years, I taught Emerson to aspiring translators of American literature in one of the most prestigious postgraduate programs in Spain. Here in Barcelona, it's a bilingual city, and yet the center of Spanish language publishing. The program's faculty was sterling. Students have won important prizes. They have impressive bibliographies. I've had the opportunity to give conferences in Harvard. I've been placed on the board for the translation program at Yale University Press's Magellan's collection, and all for being a professor in this program in this cosmopolitan city. And alas, that program was suddenly canceled recently with a full roster of students. We were never given a reason why. So why Emerson? Why now? Because he was the first hippie, a contestarian. He gave American intellectual tradition its first edge, a fighting chance. He read Plato, he read Goethe, he read the Bible, but he also brought Buddhist and Hindu sacred texts, philosophy, in to the American tradition. He read Persian poets, Hafez, Sadi, and he countered American materialism and greed with ideas of justice and social responsibility. The civil rights movement, ideas of nonviolent protest, and environmental activism. So his ideas roused European artists and poets and thinkers from Nietzsche, Baudelaire, Maeterlinck, George Eliot, Coleridge, Proust, Tolstoy, Rilke, and more contemporary writers like Camus, Borges, José Martí, Susan Sontag, and David Foster Wallace. Nature is unity, nature is spirit, nature is the mind precipitated. I believe his writing is worth returning to today, faced as we are with materialism on a global scale and its environmental devastation. Emerson's work is eminently quotable, so I'm going to give 2 gems this evening. One is, this world we live in is no more than thickened light. And the second, what you do speaks so loudly, I can't hear what you say. So now, perhaps, John, as we're nearing the end of our conversation, we could return to Poland and to a poet, Zbigniew Herbert, who I know, again, means a great deal to you. I believe you're in the process now of editing a selection of his work. Could you tell us something about it?
Yes, yeah. To be accurate, I'm co-editing with the poet and translator Alisa Valles a selection of Herbert's poems in translation to mark the centenary of his birth in 1924. Now, I first heard of Herbert in the early 1960s when I was living and working in England. Some poems of his were read on the radio and published in a journal called Modern Poetry in Translation. Disseminated in deliberately plain translations, the work of Herbert and other poets from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia came as a welcome shock to the rather torpid and insular British poetry scene of the time. What struck British readers was the directness with which these poets from the East dared to address life and death issues. Their work seemed to be imbued with the strength of a coiled spring. That strength seemed to have its source in their personal courage and integrity as they stood up for the truth of the individual vision against a monolithic orthodoxy. At the plainest level, they offered a lesson in what it could mean to be a poet. Zbigniew Herbert was not a political poet. He was apolitical because he was suspicious of systems of all kinds. What is wrong with systems, to Herbert, is precisely that they are systems. What is wrong with laws is that they are laws. Beware of angels and other executives of perfection. In many of his poems, Herbert hides with fine irony behind the mask of an individual called Pan Cogito, Mr. Cogito, the man who thinks too much. But as it turned out, Pan Cogito was capable of bearing considerable poetic weight, and the poem called The Envoy of Pan Cogito, dating from 1983, seems to me one of the great poems of the 20th century, a poem of rhetorical grandeur and moral ferocity. Herbert's later years were not happy. He died in 1998. His verdict on himself and his life's work, I quote, "A memory too large and a heart too small." It is a verdict I think we can take with a grain of salt. The true Zbigniew Herbert is constituted by a body of poetry that extends over 4 demanding decades of the history of modern Europe. His response to those demands was to remain stubbornly, monotonously faithful to the human, not some timeless ideal of the human, but the flesh and blood human, stumbling in the dark across a landscape littered with the bones of brave men.
Well, on that, I think we're coming close to the end of our conversation. But before we do, I know you are a fervent reader of Russian literature, and these affinities appear in so much of your writing, particularly in The Master of Petersburg. But in your essays, you've written about the philosophical and moral power of writers like Dostoevsky and Tolstoy as being heirs of a Christian tradition more vital than Western Christianity. So where does Russia fit in to a discussion of contemporary Europe from the outside?
Yeah. When you and I embarked on this conversation an hour ago, I promised that I would not be expressing opinions on subjects I knew nothing about. But I can't close off this discussion of Europe as seen from the outside without mentioning Russia, because Russia is part of Europe and yet is not part of Europe, which is ultimately the reason why the West is and is not at war with Russia today. Let me simply make 3 brief points about Russia. 1. Like Ethiopia, like Armenia, like Georgia, like those Balkan lands, including Greece, that until 200 years ago were part of the Ottoman Empire, Russia has been a Christian land, yet has had no share in Western Christian civilization, as that has developed over time. 2. The defeat of the Soviet Union in the Cold War may have been a good thing, but the humiliation of Russia post-1989 was on a par with the humiliation of Germany post-1918, and, as in the case of Germany, has had disastrous consequences for all of us, as we can see. 3. The Western package of democratic politics and capitalist economics is not an exportable product. It was imposed on Russia in the 1990s and at once turned toxic. It has similarly failed throughout Africa, which may be why the condition of Russia today seems less mysterious from an African perspective than from a Western European perspective. In this moment of historical crisis for Russia, we should continually have in mind the destiny of the Russian intelligentsia, the brave and resourceful and, and historically minded sector of Russian society, which, since the early 19th century, has done its best against appalling odds to chart a course for their motherland into the future. Now is not the time to sever links with these Russians to consign them to oblivion. On the contrary, we should take every opportunity to reassure them that we are with them in their unique struggle.
Moltes gràcies, John. Thank you very much. Moltes gràcies, Judit. Moltes gràcies a tothom.